Dr. Kevin Macdonald, it is great to have you on the show today. Most of my audience will be very familiar with your work, most notably the Culture of Critique trilogy, including A People That Shall Dwell Alone, Separation and Its Discontents, and of course, Culture of Critique, Evolutionary Analysis of Jewish Involvement in 20th Century Intellectual and Political Movements. Also, your work as editor of the Occidental Observer, which produces original content touching on the themes of white identity, white interest, and the culture of the West. According to your Wikipedia page, Dr. Macdonald, you are an American anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist, a white supremacist, and a retired professor of psychology at Cal State Long Beach. Now, I'm pretty sure that last one is true.
Yeah, the last one is true,
yeah. So you have 2 minutes, sir, to tell us why you are not an anti-Semite or a white supremacist. Go.
Well, it's just ridiculous. I mean, Wikipedia, I mean, I've tried to edit my article there on Wikipedia, just put in things to correct some of this stuff, and it disappears. They are in control over there, and I just have given up. Well, I'm certainly a critic of Jewish behavior, I suppose you could say, but when you say I'm an anti-Semite, I don't know exactly what that means. It's a pejorative. Obviously, it's a label that people live in fear of being called. And conspiracy theories, I think I've documented everything I've put out, and I'll argue with anybody. I have argued with anybody. And I don't think anyone's come close to refuting, say, the Culture of Critique, which is the most important book, I suppose. It's the most controversial. So it's just ridiculous, but that's what you expect. It's sort of like, what you expect MSNBC to say about you, or CNN or something. That they're just, it's totally politicized and biased, and they have control of Wikipedia and a lot of other media, and that's the unfortunate thing right there.
Yeah, it was funny when you agreed to do this interview. I told my friends and family and my subscribers, they know all about you and read your books and familiar with your work and all. But I told my friends and family specifically, do not read, or if you do read the Wikipedia page, put a grain of salt in there, because you're right. This is, first of all, Wilhelm Marr came up with this term anti-Semite in the late 19th century. And of course, it's just another way that they use language to control the narrative and to smear anyone with whom they don't agree. E. Michael Jones defines a Jew as basically rejectors of Logos. It's very simple. Those who reject Christ, they reject the natural order of things. And that's why you see these perverted movements that they are sometimes behind, the transgender movement and the like. And now, the recent news being that California is now working toward normalizing pedophilia. As Gilad Atzmon put it on Adam Green's No More News, Jewish power is the power to silence opposition to Jewish power. To try to sum up your thesis in the trilogy, it's essentially this: that Jews have developed evolutionary strategies to subvert and ultimately to destroy their host nations.
Well, I wouldn't phrase it quite like that, but yeah, I mean, there are 3 books, as you say, trilogy. The first book is really about how traditional Jewish societies work, especially in Europe, and how they organized themselves, how they got along with their neighbors, or didn't get along with their neighbors, and how they sort of got along with each other, and how they would regulate their communities, say, by preventing other Jews from horning in on their monopolies or that kind of thing. So there's just a lot of detail, but it's about traditional societies. I don't get beyond the 18th century probably there. But then I have the second book is on anti-Semitism, and that goes back really throughout history, going back really to the Old Testament. I have a chapter, the second chapter, where I sort of summarize attitudes, anti-Jewish attitudes throughout the centuries, and it starts with the Book of Exodus, where the Pharaoh, rejected, expelled the Jews, and all that happened there. And again, it could be apocryphal, but at the same time, it shows, this attitude, this negativity that is a huge part of Jewish identity, by the way. I mean, it still is. I mean, the Jews who are socialized within the Jewish community, educated in Jewish schools or synagogues and all that, I mean, they have this idea that Jews have always been persecuted, and especially in Europe and the West, and it's always irrational. It's always just a result of hate. There's no reason for it. So in my second book, I talk about the reasons for it. I mean, that there were real reasons behind this. It wasn't just, Jews killed Christ or something like that. That just wasn't ever an issue, or not the most important issue by far. But anyway, so that was the second book, and then the third book, I talked about these intellectual political movements, and I've expanded on that ever since. By including, say, material on neoconservatives and other movements that I find to be Jewish. To show that a movement is Jewish, and sometimes people criticize me, how can you falsify your theory? It's simple to falsify my theory. All you have to do is show that the people involved in these movements that I talk about did not identify as Jews and did not care about Jewish interests. So the burden of my book is to show that that is the case. They did identify as Jews. They did have an interest in Jewish issues, and particularly ending anti-Semitism. If you take someone like Freud or the Frankfurt School people, they were very concerned about Jewish issues and about anti-Semitism in particular. And so their theories, or you look at Boas, very concerned about anti-Semitism, very determined to sort of knock down European culture from its very high perch. If you think about where Europe was in the year 1900, 1920, 1930, Europe dominated the world. Europeans dominated the world. I mean, it's like something like 94% of the landmass of the world was controlled by Europeans. So yeah, they were a powerful group, and Boas tried to take them down, to say cultural relativism, they're no, we've really been living with that ever since, because Boas has been extremely influential, departments of anthropology. I did document all that. So again, this is not just a conspiracy theory. This is something that is rooted in actual data. It can be falsified, and when I hear about the article in Wikipedia, and I haven't even read it for a long time, and I'm labeled as some conspiracy theorist, it's just outrageous. It's just outrageous, and it's just depressing, and it's not fair. But what do you expect? This is politics. This is not fair. You don't expect for fairness here.
When Amy Dean of Tikkun magazine says, and she, a Jew herself, says, quote, Jews are behind gay marriage. Barbara Lerner Specter, Jews are behind immigration. The executives at Vivid Entertainment, Jews are behind porn. Feminism, the sexual revolution in general, these are Bolshevism. These movements are certainly predominantly Jewish. That is without question. And
if you look at the activists involved, especially at the beginning, huge Jewish overrepresentation. I've never published anything on pornography. Say I just referred to it a couple of times, but you can find Jewish scholars saying that. I mean, it's a Jewish industry, and as you say, the gay marriage, there's a Jewish lawyer who takes credit for that, and it's just many of those things, and they've been very destructive of our traditional culture. I mean, the culture I grew up in. I'm an old guy. I grew up in the 1950s, and the culture now is just completely removed from what that was. And the culture of the 1950s was good for families. It was good for socializing children and producing a healthy, adaptive society. And since the 1960s, it's been one thing after another. But the sexual revolution really took off in the 1960s, and so that is part of cultural critique in the chapter on psychoanalysis.
So Paul Warburg, a Jewish Freemason back in 1950, said that we will have world government, whether that is by conquest or by consent. What we are seeing with Black Lives Matter, with Antifa, with the response to the coronavirus, do you see Jewish fingerprints behind this kind of psyop?
Well, Jews have been the backbone of the left in America throughout the 20th century and into the present. And, in terms of financing and activism and so on. And one of the key points about the left has been anti-nationalism. And that's really very common. They don't resonate with the nationalism of these diaspora countries. Now, when it comes to Jewish nationalism and Israel or Zionism, that's a different story. But you can go back as far as you want, and Jews have opposed nationalism, and that was certainly part of the Bolshevik Revolution in the 1917, going into the 20s and 30s, was internationalism, and the idea was to foment a world revolution, and then basically that worldview, and I think there's a lot of Anglos, a lot of white non-Jews who have signed on to this globalist attitude. I mean, there's no question about it. But that, so it's not. I don't want to say it's only Jews. Usually when you look into it, you can find a major role for Jews with movements like that, globalism. That we're seeing now. And I think that's really what happened when Donald Trump was elected. Whatever you think of what he did afterwards, and a lot of critics, including myself, everybody's criticizing Trump for a lot of different things. But his rhetoric during the campaign was just absolutely off the map for these people. America first, that's nationalism. They don't like nationalism. They don't want that idea. And the whole idea of limiting immigration, deporting illegals, that absolutely opposed to the fundamental, zeitgeist of the globalism, and that we, free movement of peoples, let people come here, it doesn't matter, and of course that dominates the Democrat Party now, and really an awful lot of Republicans who hated Trump for that very reason. They were globalists. They wanted immigration for the Chamber of Commerce, cheap labor, and all that, So Trump threw a total wrench into the establishment with his rhetoric, and of course he hasn't come through with a lot of that, but he's gone in that direction. And even now, I think the contrast between Trump versus Biden is pretty clear. Anyway, the point is that the left has opposed nationalism forever, and so certainly Jews have played a major part in that, because they don't really identify with, they typically don't identify with the people and culture of the host society. They have a sense of international sense that Jews in France are more important to them than Americans, in Memphis or St. Louis or something. That they are have more common interests. Jews in France or Germany or Israel or Venezuela, they have more common interests. And that was one of the themes of anti-Semitism I wrote about in the second book, is this question of loyalty. Who are you really loyal to? Are you more loyal to the country that you live in, or to international, to other Jewish communities around the world?
Yeah, and so And so often the policies that they push for over here are entirely different than what they push for in Israel.
Absolutely, absolutely, no question about it.
So
Look
I'm
at
glad.
Israel. The immigration policy is very restrictive. Only Jews can immigrate there, and yet, and if you go through your whole pedigree to establish yourself as Jewish, and if you did something analogous in this country, you have to show that you're a white European to get into America. Oh, they would go absolutely crazy about that. I mean, a big part of Jewish activism in America was to establish the idea that America is a proposition nation. It has nothing to do with ethnicity. The 1924 immigration law favored Northwest Europe, and that was reaffirmed in 1952. And that was just anathema to Jewish intellectuals and activists. And they finally overturned it in 1965.
I'm glad you mentioned globalism, though, because I have been trying to parse this out. What is happening right now in this inverted reality in which we live? Is it Zionism, communism, globalism? What kind of revolution exactly is this? Or is it all three?
Well, certainly, what they're aiming at here, and this is what we see all this unrest and rioting and everything really is a top-down thing. I mean, you could stop this Antifa garbage in Portland, say, where they're burning things, they're harassing people, they're injuring police. There's been a murder already. You could shut that down tomorrow with political will. You just bring in the military and start really kicking ass and arresting people, putting them in prison. Don't let them out on bail. And that sort of thing. But right now they have a revolving door. Why is that? Well, because the state of Oregon and the mayor of Portland that's the way they want it, I guess. And so it keeps on going. So this is a top-down thing. And we have to realize it really is part of the sort of globalist, Democrat-led, left-wing kind of thing. These people are all on the left. They're all, very much tuned into diversity and Antifa, fascism, and all that. So but it's a top-down thing. And so sometimes you wouldn't realize that. So many of the people involved in the riots are poor Black people, and these white people who are living in their mother's basement, and really are just sort of losers in life. You look at their pictures, a lot of transgender people and a lot of people that just look weird and like they could never fit into any society. And those are the people on the streets. But then you got Apple Computer and Google and all of them giving money to Black Lives Matter, and somebody is funding these Antifa. I mean, they have credit cards and all kinds of things that are being funded by somebody, probably the sort of leftist networks of various kinds.
Yeah, and one of the most laughable things was when, I don't know if you saw this, but Dave Chappelle's recent Netflix special or whatever. I didn't watch it, but I heard a quote from him talking about the George Floyd incident and the response to that, Black Lives Matter and all that this is the streets talking. No, this is globalist.
This is not the streets talking.
This is Zionist global elites using, I think, communistic measures to exact control upon a population.
Is what it's about. Absolutely, I totally agree. That is the end game. They want total control, and they want to end free speech. They want to be able to imprison anybody who has different thoughts, different ideas. Just like they did in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, or worse. I mean, the end game in here is hard to see, but if you look at history, and you look at what happened in the Bolshevik Revolution, where Jews were very much involved, and especially in the security forces that were so responsible for the terror and the torture and the mass murder, that can happen again. I mean, you see the hatred on the street now, and so much anti-white hatred. It really is a race war that's brewing here. And in my opinion, you know, if it happens sooner, it's better than later, simply because we have more power now and more people, you know, compared to the whole population. We're still a majority, and an awful lot of guns out there, and we can take care of ourselves, I think, right now, if we had the political will. And if push comes to shove, you know, I mean, I know there are a couple cities that I've heard of where the Antifa were bussed in to have some kind of march, you know, and all that, and people they were met with a whole lot of white guys with guns, and they just turned around and left. And you know, we still could turn this around, and it's getting to the point where you have these murders now. You know, it's escalating. It's escalating. And if Trump wins another term, I think there'd be violence in the streets. That there would be. They'd go crazy. If they did last time in 2016, all those months leading up to the inauguration, there were riots in Washington D.C. and Portland and a lot of places. We'll see that
Now,
again, and it'll be worse this time.
now that you mention that, I heard an interesting theory. This is not mine, but I heard someone posit that what they plan to do in running Biden and Kamala Harris, which is probably the worst ticket in history,
Oh,
they are in effect throwing the election so that they can burn the country down for 4 more years. Not only that, but what happens with, I think they are programming us now with all of these news reports about the mail-in voting and Trump not leaving office. That's already accepted that he's not going to leave office. So what happens? I think 2000, the election then was kind of a training ground for what is going to happen now with the hanging chads and all that. And we waited for a while to find out who the winner was. So in this election, I'm thinking it's very similar in that no one will be declared a winner. When it comes January, Trump can't take office because he hasn't been officially elected. Biden can't take office because he hasn't won yet. And the plan, as this theory goes, is to then put Nancy Pelosi in, who under those circumstances would be in control at that point.
you know, who knows what's going to happen? I think it could be a contested election, like the year 2000, but even worse, where, you know, the difference between Gore and Bush wasn't that great. You know, nobody getting too uptight about that, except for the professionals who depend on that for jobs and things. But this is Armageddon. I mean, and I think for either side, because since then we've had this massive polarization. You know, we can't talk to the other side anymore. I mean, mainstream Republicans can't talk to Democrats the way they used to. Yeah, growing up, you know, there was a lot of cooperation among the Democrats and Republicans, and they were friends and everything else. And I don't think anymore. It's just absolute polarization. You can't talk to people across the political divide anymore. And so I think that, you know, when that happens, it's sort of like what happened before the first Civil War in the 1860s. You know, I don't know that they're going to throw the election. I think they want to win. And if they do, they would put in a leftist program. They would try to, you know, get in, you know, they would love to have Supreme Court appointments. They might try to pack the court. There, all kinds of things could happen there. Because they would like to have it, again, they want to end free speech. They want to end the Second Amendment as well, and disarm Americans. So I think they would love to get in, but if they do, if Trump gets in again, I think there will be an awful lot of violence. I wouldn't doubt that for a second. We already know what happened in 2016. It's going to be worse, as I said. I mean, it's got to be worse. And but I think that you know, that in a way that's good. We have to have it out, because every year, you know, the percentage of the population that's white is decreasing. And as I say, sooner the better. You know, we still have quite a bit of power here. And we can, if we had a civil war tomorrow, I think we would do very well. And a lot of the military would be on our side. Although, you know, I think one of the big problems there is that the officer corps has really been corrupted. And, you know, the typical left, they have left nothing, no stone unturned. And those officers, I think, have been very much vetted to be on board with the sort of Zionist globalism, wars for Israel are wonderful, and that sort of thing. I mean, in Israel and the American Jewish community has all these programs where they take military officers over to Israel and they socialize them there and they train together and they make personal friendships. And, you know, there's this whole incredibly intricate web between the Israeli military and the American military. And so, you know, if there was some kind of confrontation, you know, the officers have been socialized into this, an awful lot of them.
You wrote the preface to Giles Corey's new book, The Sword of Christ, which I think would have flown under my radar had I not caught that article in uns.com. I quote, as I write this in the summer of 2020, we are experiencing what feels like the end game in the Jewish conquest of white America. Because Jews have become a hostile elite with a powerful position in the media and the educational system, Jewish attitudes in the 1950s that the US is a, quote, awful, corrupt, immoral, undemocratic, racist society, unquote, are now entirely mainstream, and the cancel culture that we now see is indeed directed most of all toward white red state voters. You talk about white dispossession, and I really appreciate the work that you've done there. In a supposedly white supremacist country, it really is amazing that there are very few people speaking out about white interest. Right. And if you do so, you will be canceled and, you know, or worse.
It's a joke that, you know, the idea that there's this white supremacy when the entire educational system, all the media really, even including Fox, they never talk about white interests explicitly. The talking heads don't advocate white interests. They shy away from that. There might be some implicit there. You know, Tucker Carlson is interesting and verges on that certainly, but you don't see that. And you know, so white supremacy is underground if it exists at all. Well, it does exist. I think if you ask white people about becoming a minority, they don't like it. And a lot of them don't realize we're becoming a minority, you know, because it's not like the media advertises this. I mean, it's not something that they really want to discuss, honestly. You know, why are we doing this? Is this what about the interests of white people? Are white people going to get a fair shake in the legal system when there's a non-white majority? When we already see this hatred and hostility, when you start seeing that in the system, I mean, it's interesting. Trump recently has said that you can't have this critical race theory, you know, taught to employees of the U.S. government, because they were doing that. They would have, you know, in the State Department or Defense or whatever, they'd bring in these consultants and they would go on about critical race theory, which is basically white guilt mongering, and saying how evil whites are. And that was being funded by the federal government. So Trump put a stop to that, I guess, as we said. And then he also said today or yesterday, he said that any school that teaches the 1619 Project, you know, this is the series in the New York Times by a black activist woman, basically, you know, talking about how racist whites are and all that. That's getting into the school system now. And Trump is saying we won't fund schools that have the 1619 Project. Well, that's a great idea. Both those, you know, getting rid of critical race theory and getting rid of the 1619 Project, using federal power to do that, great moves. We'll see, you know, if it actually works. But those are the kinds of things that, that, and I said, there's an article in the New York Times just a day or two ago saying that Trump is appealing to the white base. And I think he really is. Those kinds of things, and even though he doesn't say white interests and stuff like that, he is doing things to appeal to the white base. And it could be electioneering. This is an election. He's got to build up his white support. He's also emphasizing the riots and all that. But I have to congratulate him for that. And coming out against critical race theory at a time when there's this massive moral panic about race in the country. I mean, you're at a point where white people are kissing the feet of black people and flagellating themselves about their racism, and you see public figures saying all whites are racist and all that kind of stuff. It's just common now, and yet you have Trump opposing that. Well, that's got to ring a bell to a lot of people, because people don't want to. White people, are really the nicest people in the world. I mean, they're the most open to foreigners because of individuals. I wrote a book about individuals. We're more open. We're less ethnocentric, and but there are limits, and they're pushing those limits now. And that's why when I'm on Twitter or something like that, I always emphasize hatred towards whites. You see it all the time now. Black guys just going up to a white guy and clocking him one, sucker punching. And I saw a black woman in an educational setting just talking about all whites are racist, that kind of thing. Just routine now. I mean, do you seriously think that white people are going to get a break in the judicial system, in a trial? No, if whites are a minority, they're not. It's just utopian. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, and this sentiment is everywhere. And, the Sarah Jong thing at the New York Times, editor of the New York Times.
Exactly. That's a good example.
I mean, it's all over the place, and yet we can't talk about it. And that's why I get what you're saying, where Trump has to play this crafty game, this 6 million D chess, where he has to do everything but say, I am working for white interest.
You can't say that.
He can't say that, but he can do certain things.
Yeah.
I mean, there is the argument, of course, how subverted his when you have his administration is when you have Jared Kushner and those people,
exactly,
the neocons and all of that. I mean, the subversion that goes on there. What has been really disheartening for me is talking to some of my friends from college on the subject of white interest and white dispossession. And they're like, what's the big deal? Whites are a majority, so it's in poor taste to discuss.
You can't see 20 years down the line, Jesus.
Yeah, right. Why are white people so scared of becoming a minority? How would you respond to such sentiments?
Well, I think what you're saying about Sarah Jong, and I include her in my book, recent book, and there are a lot of other examples like that. Of real hatred towards whites, and she's employed by the New York Times, and she doesn't lose her job for saying that. So the anti-white hatred now is mainstream, and it is coming from elite media and other educational system. And like I said, the 1619 Project on slavery, just outrageous propaganda. The critical race theory. Well, when you look at the news articles about that, about Trump ending government funding of critical race theory seminars, propaganda session, they always call Trump is ending racial sensitivity training. Who could be against racial sensitivity? But of course, that's not what's really taught there. It's taught about how all whites are racist, especially white males, and the whole leftist story, really, and it's all about white guilt, and That's the kind of thing, though, I think is waking white people up, and as are the riots. So we'll see what happens in the election. I'd be surprised, about 60% of white people vote Republican now. We'll see. Is it going to be more than 60%? If in fact whites are waking up to the reality of what this multicultural America really is, then it would be more than that, substantially more. We'll see.
There is this guy, Marty Nemko, Nemko. Have you heard of this guy's name?
I don't know him. No.
He's a psychologist out of Berkeley, a Jewish psychologist out of Berkeley, and he writes in an October 2018 article in Psychology Today entitled "White Male Shouldn't Be an Epithet." He is one of the only ones that I know is speaking out on the impact of white hating culture on young white boys growing up. And this is how out to lunch we are as a people. The only guy that's speaking out for us is Jewish.
Well, we're speaking out, but yeah, he's at Berkeley, and it could be that he gets a break sort of by being Jewish. There's also a woman, Amy Wax, at the University of Pennsylvania. I think she said some things about the superiority of Western civilization and sort of traditional values, traditional American values of hard work and that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, it's just very rare. I mean, it's welcome when you see it. I hadn't heard of that guy, but there are some Jews that are on our side. Ron Unz is great. He's basically on our side. I mean, he posts a lot of our stuff. He posted an article from our site today. He posts a lot of my articles, and he's actually got all my books online there. All my books can be accessed at unz.com. So and he's a good guy, and he's open, and he writes things about the Holocaust. He writes things about Bolshevism, the Jewish role, and he doesn't pull any punches. It's there.
Cancel culture, you mentioned, and the way that the banning waves take place from time to time. We had one back in June where Stefan Molyneux, Jared Taylor in American Renaissance was banned from YouTube and other platforms. Yet Adam Green's No More News and other channels that really dig into the Jewish question are kept up. It's very strange how these bans work. Yeah. Because I think it's almost, and correct me if I'm wrong or if you feel a different way, it's almost like they're trying to create an environment in which we are not sure who is a shill or who is controlled opposition. Do you think that's kind of what is at work here when they go through these ban waves?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it is weird. I mean, like Richard Spencer has never been knocked off of Twitter. I'm still on Twitter. At the same time, my videos have been scrubbed off of YouTube, as I understand it. And, we've been deplatformed by PayPal, by the credit card processors and all that. So it's been hard to get donations and subscriptions and that sort of thing. And so it seems hit and miss. We do know that the ADL is involved in a lot of this. But they may think some websites, some people are more important than others, and it could be that there's some resistance from Twitter. I'm knuckling under completely. I mean, when I'm on Twitter, I certainly try to watch what I say. I mean, I've been suspended briefly a couple times for ridiculous things. I mean, just ridiculous. It's not like I denied the Holocaust or something, God forbid. I mean, I don't do that kind of stuff, so I try to watch my language and all that, but I still try to say the point. I don't really mince, if I see an issue out there, I'll talk about it. And they haven't gotten rid of me yet. But they got rid of Jared Taylor a long time ago. Twitter did, and then in June, I guess they got rid of him on YouTube. it's just one thing after another. But I do think the cancel culture would expand if if they could get rid of the First Amendment. This is the big sticking point that they don't like, and they would like the government to be able to regulate speech. Certainly, they have a lot of influence over these companies, but you know, I mean, perhaps Google more than anything else, and Facebook's resisted even Holocaust denial. They have resisted getting rid of people who talk about that. I don't even go on Facebook. I can't stand Facebook. But anyway, it's not a consistent picture, as you say, and a little bit confusing.
The one of the questions that one of my subscribers had asked me to ask you is that the role of subversives in the white identitarian movement, specifically talking about the administrator of the Daily Stormer, Weave, being by his own admission a Jewish man. There are also many other prominent Jewish people in the quote unquote alt-right, which is a term that's another one of those terms that's impossible to define. Laura Loomer, Mike Cernovich, Maya Yiannopoulos, are themselves Jewish or partially Jewish. Do you think the movement was in part promoted by Jewish individuals who may or may not have hoped to play a Pied Piper role in popularizing the alt-right to harm the nationalist movement?
Yeah, well, a lot of these guys are sort of alt-right, Cernovich, Milo. They're not really totally on board with white interests. But, I think there are such Jews who do, a few maybe, who really identify with white interests and perhaps think it's good for the Jews. And it may be, because, a multicultural America may not be entirely what they want, because these people are not so sensitive to Holocaust issues and guilt as white people are. My attitude is that if Jews really want to work with us, that's fine. I would accept them, but I wouldn't allow them to lead the movement, and I wouldn't allow them, and I would want them to acknowledge the role of Jews in where we're at, and I would want them to direct their energy towards other Jews to try to persuade them, if they are really sincere about this. But what I don't like to see are people like Milo or Cernovich who are sort of partway there and partway not, and are sort of lead a sort of fake movement, and in a way that is sort of like leading it down the wrong path, really. I don't
And
like
to also stop this gaslighting stuff that goes on every time. There's that meme every single time, where every single time you hear of someone on Twitter or social media saying, fellow white people, we must do better.
Right.
And then there'll be, a post somebody will catch that they admitted to being Jewish a couple of months before such a statement. So,
right, exactly.
so that kind of stuff, I think, drives people crazy.
That's become sort of almost a joke now. People, if a Jewish guy talks about fellow white people, they're going to get a lot of static on Twitter, believe me.
Chinese Jewish connection. I know the Chinese have praised Jews for how they have controlled major industries and propaganda in the US and Europe. This is another question from one of my subscribers. Obviously, communism is a theory that was created and promoted by Jews, but how deep does the connection to China go? Do the Jews play a direct role in the development of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, and how connected are they to the current regime?
Yeah, I really am not a good person to answer that, frankly. I know there were some prominent Jews in the early communist movement in China. I do know, and I've heard that one strategy that's being used, because China is kind of a tough nut to crack for them, because they are sort of ethnocentric and they have a sense of themselves as a people. And I think they are aware of Jewish power in America and elsewhere. So, yeah, if you're a sensible, foreign, leader, you have to know where the power, how America works, right? If you're, say you're the premier of China, you have to know how America works, and that's partly knowing about Jewish power, isn't it? And so these people understand that. I think one strategy I think that is being used is to intermarriage. That you have some intermarriage between wealthy Jews and Chinese, and then they get into the establishment, the elites, and then you have sort of half Jewish, half Chinese kids. So I mean, I've heard that, and I don't know how widespread it is, but I think those countries are going to be tough nuts to crack for Jews. Japan as well, for the same reason.
Was looking through your biography and the things that you had done early on in graduate school and later on with parent-child bonding, parent-child play, and those kinds of studies in the California State University system. There you are in academia, and you're doing these kinds of studies. And then 2 years later, I think it was 2 or 3 years later, there's this explosive creativity that comes from you about the Jewish question. What led you into that that topic, and what ramifications did you face in the university system as a result?
Yeah, well, in the 1980s, I wrote a book on social and personality development about children. But the last chapter was really about the Spartans and how they socialized children as a group kind of thing, the ancient Spartans. And so I got the idea of a group strategy. And this was very controversial and sort of non-existent in the evolutionary literature on humans. And so I was thinking, I want to pursue this, because human groups are different from animal groups, and we can regulate our groups, and we can, if someone is not on page, you can throw them out. You can, like in the military, if you're in a military unit and you don't obey the officer, they may shoot you in a time of war or something like that. Jewish groups did the same thing. They would expel people who were not on board. They would sometimes kill them, so that groups are able to structure themselves to be an important force because they're all on page and they're cohesive. So that was really what led to it. And I said, this is an important thing in group evolution, between group competition. And what better group to study than Jews, because there's so much written about them over history. And they were a tight group, unlike the West. Well, Western people tend to be individualists. We tend not to be group oriented compared to them. And so that's how it started. And, it was innocent enough. But the more I got into it, I started thinking, these people are not on board with me. They really don't have my interests at heart. And especially when I was writing culture critique and I read about Jewish involvement in immigration policy, that sort of did it. I'm sort of thinking, why, how am I benefiting from this? Of course I'm not. And they're creating this idea that America is nothing but a proposition, that anybody can be an American, really against the huge amount of traditional American thinking and our immigration policy until 1965. So that's when I started getting sort of an edge. These people are not on board. And then reading about, Zionism, and after 2000, I didn't have anything on neoconservatism in the book and culture critique, but after that, with George Bush coming to be president, and then 9/11 and the wars, you really started to see the power of neoconservatism. And then you start looking at that as a totally Jewish movement, with some Gentile, some non-Jewish window dressing, shall we say. But it really was a Jewish movement. And so that's the thing. And again, it conflicts with our interests. as a country, we don't have any interest in being in Syria or Afghanistan. We don't have any interest in a war with Iran. And yet that's what's being pushed by the Jewish community. And,
well, right. And everyone says, well, they're our greatest ally. We got a bunch of enemies. We got a bunch of enemies over there, but we didn't have any enemies before.
We didn't have those enemies. And we're paying them $3.8 billion a year just to be our friends, which is ludicrous. And so, the idea that they are our allies is silly. We're doing it for them. It's not an American interest. And a lot of people have understood that. I mean, a great book came out around the same time I wrote my material on conservatism. It was a book by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, The Israel Lobby. I mean, again, they were called conspiracy theorists. A Harvard professor, University of Chicago, they do all this research. Oh, shoddy research, conspiracy theory. That's what you get. Comes with the territory. If you criticize them, if you criticize their interests, you will be labeled that way.
Well, and you must have faced a hell of a hornet's nest when you started digging into this stuff. And I believe you testified at David Irving's trial. Is that right?
Yeah, and that's something that's misunderstood, because I didn't testify about the Holocaust. I testified about simple fact: the Jewish organizations had prevented him from speaking, and they tried their best to shut him down, to cancel him, as we would say now. I had that in the second book, his little footnote. And he saw it, I guess, and so then he asked me to testify, just to that point. So, okay, I testified to that point. Actually, he just basically read what I'd written, and I said, yeah. I said yes a couple of times, and that was the end of my testimony. And they didn't cross-examine me. So it was not about the Holocaust, and people think that. And my attitude is academic freedom and freedom of speech. He should be allowed to say those things. And he's a reputable historian. He's written a lot of good stuff by any standard. And so I felt that I should be on his side, and simply testifying to the simple truth that he can't go to Australia, for example. And he's got, I think his daughter lives there or something. He's banned from Austria, or he went to prison in Austria and Germany and all this stuff. And, it's outrageous. But that's what we're facing. And that's what happens if we get rid of the First Amendment. It's going to be more than just Google. It's going to be the United States government putting you in prison or preventing you from traveling or whatever. That's what's going to happen.
That seems to be where
it's outrageous.
That seems to be where it's headed. And yes, it is a freedom of speech thing. And anyone who tells me that I cannot look into a subject, that subject is too taboo for me to even think about, that's the first place I go. They say riots are the voice of the unheard. Well, also violence is the voice of the unheard when you can't talk about a subject.
Yeah, that's true. And I think all subjects should be on the table. And look, I enjoyed this interview a lot, but I'm going to have to go. Is that okay? I have some guests here now, and I just have to. I'm sorry. We can do it again, though. I enjoyed it. You're very good.
And well, thank you. I enjoyed it as well. You got to go, but thank you so much. And maybe we can do this some other time.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Macdonald.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Okay. Bye.